The crack of John Hartwell's voice split the morning air like a rifle shot, and every man in the yard went still. "Pack your gear and get off my land." Cole Briggs stood with his hat in his hands and the color draining from his sun-leathered face. He was a big man, one of the biggest on the Hartwell ranch, with forearms like fence posts and a reputation for being the best roper in 3 counties. None of that saved him now. He blinked once, twice, as though the words hadn't quite landed. "Boss," I only said. "I know exactly what you said." John's voice was low and controlled, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. He stood at the top of the porch steps with his arms loose at his sides, but there was nothing relaxed about him. Every inch of him was coiled. I heard every word. Hester Ellsworth stood just inside the doorway of the ranch house, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe. She had come outside only moments before to hang the morning washing, and she had heard everything. The words Briggs had spoken were not new to her. She had been hearing words like that her entire life, words that were supposed to remind her of her place, words designed to diminish and bruise. But she had never, not once in all her 26 years, had anyone respond the way John Hartwell responded now. 3 other ranch hands stood frozen in the yard: Pete Dolan, a wiry man with a sunburned nose, Amos Burke, who chewed tobacco from dawn to dusk, and young Caleb Marsh, who was only 19 and had the good sense to stare at his boots. None of them had said a word in Hester's defense when Briggs spoke. That fact was not lost on John either. "I'm not running a ranch where a woman is made to feel small in her own home," John said. "This is not a negotiation, Briggs. This is your notice." "You are serious." It was not quite a question. "Get your wages from the foreman's box. You have 1 hour." The yard stayed silent as Cole Briggs turned, very slowly, and walked toward the bunkhouse. His shoulders were stiff with humiliation and barely contained fury. He paused once at the bunkhouse door and looked back at the porch with an expression that carried every ugly thing a man could feel but had no courage to speak aloud. Then he went inside. John turned his gaze to the 3 remaining hands. Pete Dolan looked away immediately. Amos Burke found something deeply interesting in the middle distance. Caleb Marsh, to his credit, met John's eyes briefly and then nodded a small, genuine nod before turning back to his work. John looked toward the doorway then, and Hester met his gaze. She did not know what she expected to see in his face. Satisfaction, perhaps, or that particular brand of male pride that sometimes dressed itself up as chivalry. She did not expect what she actually saw, which was a quiet, genuine concern, and something underneath it that she could not yet name. "You all right?" he asked. She exhaled a breath she had been holding for what felt like an hour. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and went to saddle his horse, as though he had done nothing more remarkable than fix a fence post. But the ranch was already quieter, and Hester Ellsworth, who had learned long ago not to expect much from the world, stood in the doorway of the Hartwell ranch house and felt something foreign and fragile begin to grow in the space behind her ribs. She did not yet have a name for it either. 3 months earlier, Hester had stepped off the southbound stage in the town of Caldwell, Kansas, on a Tuesday in April of 1879, with a carpetbag in one hand, a folded letter in the other, and precisely $4.30 to her name. The letter was from a solicitor in Wichita, informing her that the position of housekeeper at the Hartwell cattle operation, situated 12 miles east of Caldwell on the Chicaskia River, remained available if she was still interested, and that Mr. Hartwell had agreed to the terms of the arrangement, which included a private room, 3 meals daily, and a wage of $8 per month. It was not a glamorous opportunity. Hester had known that when she answered the advertisement in the Wichita Eagle 6 weeks before, but glamour was a luxury she had long since stopped expecting. What she needed was work, shelter, and a situation in which the person giving orders was someone she had not yet learned to fear. Whether John Hartwell would eventually become someone worth fearing remained, at the time of her arrival, an open question. She had known fear in many forms before Caldwell. She had been born in Cincinnati in 1853, the third daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who kept a clean house and a quiet voice. Her father had been a decent man who died of a fever when Hester was 11, leaving behind a widow, 3 daughters, and debts that devoured what little they had. Her mother had done what women in that situation did. She had remarried, quietly and quickly, a man named Gerard Dunn, who owned a dry goods store and had never struck a woman in his life, though he had a talent for making them feel invisible that was in its own way just as effective. Hester had spent the next 7 years in that house learning how to become small enough not to be noticed, while her older sisters married away, and her mother managed the difficult arithmetic of domestic peace. At 18, Hester had taken a position as a seamstress in Cincinnati, then as a shopkeeper's assistant, then as a boarding house cook in St. Louis when the seamstress shop closed in the panic year. She had followed the work westward, as so many people did in those years, carried along by the particular gravity of economic necessity. She had been engaged once, briefly, to a man named Thomas Hale who sold farm implements out of Independence, Missouri. Thomas had been pleasant enough tall, with a neat mustache and a laugh that came easily. But he had also carried a dark past that Hester only discovered piece by piece over 8 months of courtship, a past that involved debts owed to men who did not accept repayment schedules, and a temper that only emerged when he felt cornered. When Thomas Hale left Independence in the middle of the night in the autumn of 1877, owing money to 7 different creditors and 1 month's rent to his landlord, he also left Hester with a reputation that was complicated, and a heart that was not so much broken as quietly relieved, which told her everything she needed to know about how far things had actually gone. She had come to Wichita in the spring of 1878, found work as a cook in a hotel, and lasted a year before the hotel's owner, a man named Prescott, made it clear that the terms of her employment included obligations that were not in the original agreement. She left the following morning with what she was owed in wages, and the advertisement for the Hartwell position already folded in her apron pocket, because she had torn it from the paper 2 weeks earlier when she first began to understand where things with Prescott were heading. So she arrived in Caldwell in April of 1879 with a carpetbag and $4.30, and the extremely reasonable expectation that she was walking into something difficult, because that was what life had generally been. The man who met her at the stage was not John Hartwell. It was the foreman, a compact, efficient man named Ray Colbeck, who shook her hand with exactly the same brisk professionalism he would have offered anyone, which Hester appreciated immediately. Ray Colbeck was perhaps 45, with a gray-streaked beard and the look of a man who had been solving problems since before most of his hands were born. He helped her with her carpetbag, showed her to the wagon, and explained the situation during the 12-mile ride to the ranch. John Hartwell was 32 years old and had inherited the ranch from his father, Edward Hartwell, who had died the previous November. The ranch covered 4,000 acres along the river, ran approximately 800 head of cattle, and employed 12 ranch hands, a foreman, a cook's assistant, and until recently a housekeeper named Mrs. Feeney who had retired to live with her daughter in Abilene. There was also, Ray mentioned with the neutral tone of a man conveying information without editorial comment, a great deal of work to be done before the summer drives. And Mr. Hartwell himself? Hester asked. Ray Colbeck thought about it for a moment in the way people think about things they want to answer honestly. Fair man, he said finally. Hard when he needs to be, doesn't speak much. Lost his mother when he was young, his father last fall, and a brother before that. He keeps things in. That doesn't always make for an easy household, Hester observed. No, Ray agreed, but it makes for a predictable one. He doesn't change the rules without warning, and he says what he means. That last quality in Hester's experience was rarer than people admitted. She met John Hartwell that first evening at the dinner table. which was also the only table. The ranch house was large enough to be functional, but not large enough to have rooms that served only one purpose. He was already seated when she came in from the kitchen, and he stood when she entered, which surprised her enough that she nearly dropped the bread basket. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in the shade, somewhere between gray and green and difficult to read. He had a jaw that looked like it had been set in a particular expression for so long that it had stayed there, and hands that showed every hour of work he had put into this land. "Miss Ellsworth," he said, "I hope the journey was not too difficult." "It was fine," she said. "Thank you for the position. Thank you for taking it." He sat again, and that was essentially the whole of their introductory conversation, which suited them both better than either knew at the time. The first weeks were about learning the geography of the place, not just the physical layout of the house and the outbuildings and the kitchen garden and the smokehouse, but the social geography, which was more complicated and more consequential. A ranch house in 1879 Kansas existed in a particular social ecosystem. The ranch hands came in for meals in shifts, tracking mud and sweat, and the particular brand of humor that develops among men who live in close quarters and work hard. Some of them were decent, some of them were manageable, and some of them, as Hester quickly discovered, had decided before she ever arrived what kind of woman she was and what kind of treatment that warranted. It started small, the way these things do. A comment made just loudly enough to be heard. A name used in passing with a tone that twisted it into something else. A request phrased in a way that was technically within the bounds of her position, but was designed unmistakably to remind her that she was beneath notice. Cole Briggs was the most brazen about it. But he was not the only one, and the ones who said nothing while it happened were in their own way equally responsible for the atmosphere they allowed to exist. Hester had dealt with worse. She told herself that regularly during those first weeks. She kept her head down and her work excellent and her face composed, and she noted, quietly, which men had manners and which ones were performing manners when someone important was watching and dropping them when they thought no one was. She noted something else as well. She noted that John Hartwell, who was almost always out on the land and rarely in the house, except for meals, and the occasional evening spent at his desk with the account books, seemed entirely unaware of the pattern she had identified. He was not deliberately absent. He simply operated on the assumption that if his hands knew he was a fair man, they would extend that fairness to everyone under his roof without requiring specific instruction. It was an optimistic assumption, and it was wrong, and it would take the incident with Briggs on the morning of a mid-June Monday to correct it. That morning, Hester had been carrying a basket of clean laundry from the wash house to the line strung between the two cottonwood trees on the east side of the yard. Cole Briggs had been passing through the yard from the barn with two of the other hands, and he had said something, a specific kind of something, the kind that was structured as a casual observation made to his companions but pitched precisely to ensure she heard it, designed to make her feel like an object of low regard, to diminish her, to make certain she understood that in his estimation she was nothing more than hired help of the kind that ought to be grateful for any notice at all. John had come around the corner of the bunkhouse at the precise wrong moment or the precise right moment, depending on whose side of history you were standing on, with his saddle over his arm, heading for the barn to begin his day. He had heard everything, and he had fired Cole Briggs before breakfast was finished. In the days following Briggs's departure, the atmosphere of the ranch shifted in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to miss. Pete Dolan became markedly more careful about his manners. Amos Burke stopped making the particular sort of joke that derived its effect from making the listener feel their presence was an inconvenience. Young Caleb Marsh, who had been trying to navigate between the competing social pressures of the bunkhouse culture and his own instinctive decency, visibly relaxed, as though a weight had been lifted that he had not known how to name. The ranch was quieter without Briggs. That was the literal truth. The man had been loud, big laugh, loud opinions, always the first to make a noise in any room. But the quality of the quiet that remained was different from mere volume reduction. It was the quiet of a room after a threat has been removed. People breathed differently. Hester breathed differently. She still could not entirely make sense of John Hartwell. She watched him the way she had always watched people in whose household she worked carefully, from a slight distance, cataloging behavior against stated character to see where the gaps lived. What she found with John was that the gaps were smaller than she expected. He said fair, and he was fair. He said he expected hard work, and he worked harder than any man on his payroll. He said he expected honest dealing, and he dealt honestly, even when it cost him. She saw this in his management of the account books, in the prices he refused to accept for cattle he knew were being undervalued at market, in the wages he paid that she privately knew were at the higher end of what ranches in the territory were offering. But there were things he did not say, things he kept behind the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes. A loneliness that he wore so habitually that she suspected he had stopped noticing it, the way a man stops noticing a scar once it has finished healing. A grief for his family that he had apparently decided to carry privately and permanently. And something else, something that she began to notice in the weeks following Briggs's departure, that appeared specifically in the moments when he was near her. A kind of careful, deliberate awareness that was different from how he held himself with other people. A slight slowing of speech. A tendency to find additional reasons to be in the kitchen in the evenings. She noticed all of it, and she told herself firmly that she was reading too much into the behavior of a man who was simply being a decent employer in a situation that had required him to demonstrate decency. She had made errors of interpretation before. Thomas Hale had seemed like safety and turned out to be a trap. She was not going to repeat the pattern of seeing what she wanted to see, but she kept noticing. July brought the heat that the Kansas summer was known for: brutal, pressing, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer over the prairie and dried the creek down to half its usual depth by mid-afternoon. The cattle work intensified, which meant John was out on the land from before dawn until after dark most days, and the house ran largely on Hester's management. She had taken over not just the cooking and cleaning but the organization of the supply accounts, because she had a gift for numbers, and Ray Colbeck had acknowledged this with the same brisk efficiency with which he acknowledged all useful information. And between them, they had streamlined the ordering system in ways that saved the ranch approximately $40 over 2 months. When John discovered this, she had left the revised account summaries on his desk without comment, not wanting to presume. He came to find her in the kitchen on a Thursday evening when the heat had finally broken, and a cool wind was coming through the window above the wash basin. "You restructured the supply accounts," he said. She had her back to the door and did not turn immediately. "I reorganized them. The previous system was creating duplicate orders. I hope that was not overstepping. It saved money." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him standing in the doorway, the particular quality of occupied silence. "Where did you learn accounts?" he asked. She turned then, drying her hands on her apron. "My father taught me. He was a school teacher. He thought numbers were as important as letters." She paused. "He was right about that." John looked at her with the Creekwater eyes, and something in his expression shifted, a small opening, like a window unlatched. "He sounds like he was a good teacher," he said. "He was a good man," she said. "They're not always the same thing, but in his case they were." Another silence, but this one was different from the functional silences she had learned to navigate in his presence. This one had texture. "My father was a different kind of good," John said, and then seemed surprised that he had said it, as though the words had come out without prior authorization. He looked momentarily uncertain, which was so unlike his customary steadiness that it changed his face entirely. "What kind?" Hester asked, keeping her voice very level. He thought about it. "The kind that knew right from wrong but didn't always have the words for it." He ran this ranch honestly for 30 years. He never cheated a man or broke his word. He stopped. He wasn't easy to know, but I knew him well enough to know what he would have wanted from this place. And what was that? That it should be run with respect, John said. For the land, for the animals, for the people who work it. His eyes did not leave her face. For the people in the house. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. She counted them afterward. Alone in her room before he nodded once, made some neutral remark about the evening's weather and left. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the lamplight move across the yard as he walked to his desk in the office at the far end of the hall, and she was honest enough with herself, in the privacy of her own thoughts, to acknowledge that the feeling in her chest was no longer entirely without a name. August brought a new complication. His name was Gerald Marsh, no relation to young Caleb, and he arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning driving a good buggy pulled by a matched pair of bays, which told you something about him before he ever opened his mouth. Gerald Marsh was a land agent from Wichita, approximately 45 years old, with a carefully trimmed beard and the practiced pleasantness of a man whose profession depended on making people comfortable before making them uncomfortable. He had business with John about grazing rights on land adjacent to the Hartwell eastern boundary, an issue that Ray Colbeck had mentioned was complicated and had been pending for some months. John met with him in the parlor, which was the most formal room in the house and the one that was used for exactly this kind of occasion, and Hester served coffee and was efficient and invisible, because that was what a housekeeper was supposed to be. Except that Gerald Marsh was not very good at respecting that convention. He spoke to her 3 times during that morning's meeting in ways that were individually unremarkable but cumulatively pointed. A comment about the coffee being exceptional, a question about how long she had been at the ranch, a pleasantry about her being a credit to the household that was delivered with a particular kind of smile. None of it was overtly improper. All of it was deliberate. She handled it with the composure she had spent years developing, excused herself as quickly as professionally possible, and returned to the kitchen, where she stood over the bread she was kneading with unnecessary vigor and worked through the irritation until she had kneaded it into something more manageable. She did not know that John had watched Gerald Marsh watch her. She did not know this until that afternoon, when the land agent had driven his matched bays back toward Caldwell, and John appeared in the kitchen doorway with the particular expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of something he needed to say, but was working up to saying. "Marsh," he said. Yes, she was cutting vegetables for the evening stew and she kept at it because her hands needed something to do. "He was watching you." She set down the knife. "I noticed." "Did he say anything that—" "No," she said. "He was careful. Men who are good at it always are." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear something working in him, the machinery of a decision being made. "If he comes back, you don't have to be in the room," he said. "I'll manage the coffee myself." She looked up at him. He was entirely serious. "That would be an unusual thing for a rancher to do," she said. "I don't particularly care what's usual." He picked up a carrot from the cutting board, regarded it for a moment and set it back down, a gesture so human and unguarded that she felt a sudden warmth move through her chest. "Ray handles most of the supply dealings now. I can handle a land agent." "You hired me to keep this house," she said. "I'm not going to hide in the kitchen when business comes." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking you to hide. I'm saying you have the choice." She held his gaze. "Why does that matter to you?" It was a direct question, more direct than their usual exchanges, and she watched him register it. His jaw moved in that characteristic way, as though he was sorting through several possible answers and discarding most of them. "Because you should have a choice," he said finally. "You should always have had one." She did not say anything for a long moment. Outside, the cicadas were beginning their late afternoon chorus, a sound so woven into the fabric of that Kansas summer that she barely heard it anymore, except that she heard it now very clearly. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. He nodded and walked out of the kitchen, and Hester Ellsworth picked up her knife and stood at the cutting board for a full minute without using it, because her hands were not quite steady enough. September arrived, and with it a letter. Hester received very little mail because she had very few people to receive it from. Her mother had died in 1876, and her sisters were scattered, Margaret in Cleveland, Ruth in St. Louis, and they corresponded rarely, in the polite and slightly formal way of people who had grown up in the same house, but had become different enough that the growing up was now the main thing they had in common. So when Ray Colbeck handed her an envelope at breakfast one morning with a return address in Indianapolis, she turned it over twice before opening it. It was from a law firm. It informed her, in the compressed and bloodless language of legal correspondence, that her uncle by marriage, a man she had met perhaps 4 times in her life, her mother's brother's husband, had died intestate, and that the estate was being distributed among any surviving family members who could establish a claim. The letter estimated that her share, if verified and approved by the court, might amount to somewhere between $60 and $90. It was not a fortune. It was not even enough to change her circumstances dramatically. But it was something, and more than the money, it was the knowledge that the money existed, that she was not entirely without recourse, that there was something in the world that belonged to her, however small. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and carried it around for the rest of the day, touching it occasionally without quite deciding what she was touching. That evening she told John about it over supper, because he was in the kitchen that evening. He had developed the habit of appearing in the kitchen in the evenings more frequently than a man with a perfectly functional study needed to, and he listened to the whole account with the focused attention he gave to anything that mattered to someone in his household. "Will you pursue the claim?" he asked. "I'll write to the firm," she said. "I don't know if it amounts to anything." "It's yours," he said. "You should pursue what's yours." She looked at him across the table. He was eating his supper in the uncomplicated, direct way he did everything, but his eyes were on her rather than his plate, and she was suddenly and acutely aware of how ordinary and comfortable this moment was, the kitchen in the evening light, the sound of the wind picking up outside, the smell of bread and coffee, and how extraordinary it was that she felt comfortable at all. "Where did you grow up?" she asked because she wanted, suddenly and without particular strategic reason, to know more of who he was. He considered the question for a moment. "Here," he said. "This ranch. My father built the house in '58, the year before I was born. I've been on this land my whole life." "Did you never want to leave?" "I left once," he said. "After the war. I was too young for the war, but I went east for 2 years afterward, worked for a cattle broker in Kansas City." He paused, hated every minute of it. The work, the city. He said it without apology or elaboration, as though the explanation was sufficient, which for him it was. "I came back and I've been here since." He was quiet for a moment. "My brother Thomas went east and stayed. He died in '73 of cholera in Chicago. My mother had already been gone 5 years by then." "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded. "My father stopped talking about either of them after that. He kept working. I think working was how he kept living." His eyes moved to the window, where the darkening prairie sky had turned the particular shade of purple that Kansas did so well. "I understand that now more than I did then." "And now," she asked, "do you keep living by working?" He brought his eyes back to her face, and they held for a moment that stretched past the comfortable length and into something else, something that made her pulse move differently. "I'm starting to find other reasons," he said. He said it quietly and without performance, in exactly the same tone he used to talk about cattle prices or grazing rights or the weather, and that was perhaps what made it so powerful, the absence of theater, the presence of absolute sincerity. Hester set down her fork. She could feel the heat in her face, and she did not try to hide it, because she was tired of hiding things in situations that did not require hiding. "John," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. They had been very correct with each other, Mr. Hartwell and Miss Ellsworth, and the shift in register was noticeable to both of them. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to say something that a housekeeper should probably not say to her employer." He waited. He was very good at waiting. I notice that you are in this kitchen considerably more often in the evenings than is required by any practical purpose, she said. And I notice that when you are here, you pay attention in a way that is specific. She stopped. I could be wrong about what that means. You're not wrong, he said. The cicadas outside had gone quiet. The wind had settled. The kitchen held a silence that was not empty at all. I don't know what to do with that, she said honestly. I have made errors before in knowing what to do with things like that. So have I, he said. She looked at him. You. He almost smiled. She could see it at the corners of his mouth, the restraint of it. There was someone a long time ago, before my father died, a woman in Caldwell. She was a teacher. She left for a position in Missouri, and I did not say the things I should have said in time, and she went. He did not look away from her. I am considerably more careful now about saying things in time. Is that what this is? She asked. Saying things in time. I am trying, he said, to be honest with you about what I feel before I have the chance to lose the opportunity, because I think you're worth more than a missed opportunity. She sat with that for a long moment. Outside, a coyote called somewhere on the far side of the river, a long, ascending note that dissolved into the dark. I am not easy to know, she said finally, echoing without quite meaning to the words he had used about his father. I'm not asking for easy, he said. I'm asking for honest. She exhaled slowly. Then I'll be honest. I think you are the most genuinely decent man I have ever met. I think I have been trying very hard not to let that matter too much, because I have been trying very hard not to make another error in judgment. She paused. I think I have not been entirely successful. He reached across the table then and placed his hand over hers, gently, briefly, a contact that asked rather than assumed, and she turned her hand over and held his, and that was the beginning of the real thing, the true thing, the one that had been building since the morning in the yard and the evening over the account books and every careful, quiet exchange between two people who had both been hurt enough to be cautious, and were now choosing, deliberately and with full knowledge of the risk, to be something other than cautious. October came, and with it the cooler air that turned the cottonwoods gold and the prairie grass to rust and amber. The ranch settled into its autumn rhythm. The drives were largely done, the accounts reconciling, the work shifting from the breathless intensity of summer to a steadier, deeper pace. Hester and John moved into a different kind of relationship than either had previously experienced, because both of them were constitutionally unsuited to the dramatic conventions of courtship, the elaborate calls, the formal parlor visits, the carefully staged encounters, and so what they built instead was built in the texture of daily life. They talked at breakfast and at supper, and in the evenings when the work was done. They walked the river together on Sunday afternoons, something John had apparently not done with any consistent pleasure in years, and they talked about things that people talk about when they are genuinely curious about each other, her years in Cincinnati, his years learning the land from his father, her opinions on books she had read, his opinions on the future of the cattle business in Kansas, the state of the territory, the question of what the railroads were doing to the old routes, the things that had formed them and the things they hoped to build. He was not demonstrative in public, but he was consistent, which she valued more. He made certain that the household, which included now 2 new hands hired to replace Briggs and another man who had left of his own accord shortly after the firing, operated with respect for everyone in it, including and especially her. He did this quietly, through the example of his own behavior, and through the prompt and unapologetic enforcement of what he expected, and the result was that the atmosphere of the ranch continued to evolve in the direction of somewhere a person could breathe freely. Caleb Marsh, the young hand who had nodded that morning in the yard, had grown considerably in confidence since Briggs left. He was a good worker and was developing into a fine horseman, and he had the beginnings of a decency about him that had been partially suppressed by the social environment of the bunkhouse under Briggs's influence. John had begun mentoring him in a quiet, indirect way that Caleb probably didn't have the experience to recognize, but that Hester, who watched these things, could see clearly. In November, 2 things happened. The first was that Gerald Marsh, the land agent, returned. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with revised paperwork about the grazing rights, and John handled the meeting entirely himself in the office. And when it was done and Marsh was driving his bays back toward town, John came to find Hester in the kitchen garden where she was taking in the last of the root vegetables before the first freeze. "Settled," he said. "The grazing rights." "Yes, and Marsh will not be back. I made certain of that." She looked up at him. He was silhouetted against the pale November sky, and the cold had put color in his face, and he was looking at her with an expression that she had by now learned to read well enough to know meant he had done something he considered important. "How did you make certain?" she asked. "I told him this ranch and everyone in it was under my protection," he said, "and that his attentions were unwelcome in my household." She felt warmth move through her despite the cold. And he accepted that. He had limited choice in the matter, John said, with the understatement that was perhaps his most characteristic mode of expression. The grazing rights were something he needed. The conversation was brief. She stood up from the garden bed, brushing soil from her gloves, and looked at him steadily. "You protected me," she said. "I will always protect you." He said it simply, without drama or performance, and because it was simple and without drama or performance, she believed it entirely. The second thing that happened in November was that Ray Colbeck, who had been the ranch's foreman for 11 years, sat down with John one morning and told him that his wife in Emporia was unwell and that he needed to be with her, and that he would be leaving at the end of the month. John shook his hand, thanked him with genuine warmth for his years of service, and paid him 3 months' additional wages as a farewell. Ray Colbeck shook his hand back, packed his gear, and drove away on a Thursday, and the ranch was temporarily without a foreman. John spent a week running the operation short-handed, which meant 16-hour days and meals that he largely missed except for whatever Hester set aside and kept warm for him. She did this without being asked, and he ate what she left him at whatever hour he came in, and she sometimes sat up later than she needed to with a book she was only partially reading, listening for the sound of his boots on the porch. On the fourth evening of this, he came in at 9 o'clock and found her in the kitchen with her book, and she had coffee warm on the stove and a plate of bread and cold ham under a cloth on the table. "You don't have to wait up," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was full of things she had learned to read and was still learning to read all at once. "Hester," he said. "Eat something first," she said. "You look like you have been working since before the sun." "Before the sun," he confirmed and sat down at the table. She poured the coffee and sat across from him while he ate, and they talked about the foreman situation, about a candidate that Caleb had mentioned, a man his older brother worked with in Abilene who was said to be skilled and reliable. She asked questions and offered observations, and he listened to all of them with the focused attention that she had stopped finding surprising and had started finding essential. When he had finished, he set down his coffee cup and looked at her across the table in the lamplight. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I want to know if what we have built here between us is something you want to continue building." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "I want to continue building." "I want to be specific," he said, because he was always specific when precision mattered. "I am asking whether you could consider allowing me to court you properly." "You have been courting me since September," she said. "Properly," he repeated, with the ghost of a smile. "What does properly mean to you?" she asked. "It means I want to be honest about what I feel, which is that I intend to love you, Hester Ellsworth, if you will allow it. And I want to know if that is something you are willing to receive." It was, she thought, the most careful and the most complete thing any man had ever said to her. It did not perform. It did not hide behind charm or ambiguity. It said what it meant, which was that he was choosing her deliberately and openly and asking whether she would choose him. "I intend to love you too," she said. "I think I have been doing it for some time already." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. And the kitchen was warm, and the night was cold, and the lamp between them made the world small enough to be exactly the right size. And when he leaned forward and kissed her for the first time, it was unhurried and careful and more than worth everything that had brought her here. December arrived, and with it a new foreman, a man named Victor Price, recommended by Caleb's brother in Abilene, who turned out to be exactly as advertised. Skilled, reliable, fair-minded, and possessed of the kind of experience that came from having worked cattle in 3 different territories over 20 years. He was a quiet man with a direct manner and an obvious competence, and the hands took to him immediately, which told John everything he needed to know about whether the hire was a good one. Victor Price also arrived to find a ranch that was, in ways he would not have been able to articulate precisely in the first weeks, different from most ranches he had worked. He noted the absence of the particular bunkhouse culture he was accustomed to navigating, the casual dismissiveness, the hierarchy based on who could be loudest and roughest, and it took him a while to understand what he was sensing was its absence rather than a presence. When Caleb explained the situation with Briggs over a cup of coffee one evening, Victor Price nodded slowly. "Smart man," he said. "Rot spreads, better to cut it early." The preparations for the winter and the planning for the spring drives occupied November and December and a good portion of January. Hester and John continued to build what they were building, in the same slow, careful, daily way, talk in the evenings, walks on clear afternoons, the accumulation of shared understanding that is the real substance of love once the initial declaration is made. She learned things about him in layers, that he could be funny in a dry, quiet way that most people missed because it required attention to catch, that he was more widely read than his solitary life might have suggested, that he had a tenderness toward the land that was almost devotional, not the possessive pride of an owner but something closer to the gratitude of a person who knows what they have been given, that he was afraid sometimes of the scope of what he felt, because he had loved people before, his mother, his brother, his father, and lost them all, and the fear that love was something that eventually ran out of its objects was something he carried quietly, and that she was helping daily and without explicit acknowledgement between them to set down. She told him things about herself too, about Thomas Hale, and what that had taught her about the gap between what people presented and what they were, about the hotel in Wichita and what she had understood about the terms some men thought they could impose, about the specific quality of her father's goodness, the way he had taught her mathematics and Latin, and the names of stars not because he thought she needed them for practical purposes, but because he believed knowledge itself was worth having, about her sisters and the complicated affection of women who have grown up in the same difficult place and diverged into different forms of survival. He listened to all of it. He did not minimize any of it. He did not offer solutions or comparisons or the kind of commentary that is designed to demonstrate empathy while actually redirecting attention to the commenter. He simply listened, and that was precisely the right thing. January brought a hard freeze that locked the river solid and kept everyone close to the buildings for 2 weeks. In the enforced proximity of a frozen Kansas winter, the ranch became something smaller and more intimate. The kitchen fire was the center of the world, and the evenings were long, and there was more time than usual for things like conversation and reading, and the quiet company of people who had come to value each other's presence. On a Sunday evening in the second week of the freeze, John Hartwell came into the kitchen where Hester was sitting with her mending, sat down across from her, and said, without preamble because he had never been good at preamble, "I want to marry you." She looked up from the mending. "I am telling you this now," he continued, "and not framing it as a question because I want to be clear about what I want before I ask whether you want it too. I want to marry you. I want you to be here not as the housekeeper but as my wife. I want to build this life with you properly, with your full agreement and on equal terms, and I want it to be permanent." "That's a very thorough declaration," she said. "It's a very serious intention." She set down the mending. She had thought about this. She had thought about it since November, since the evening in the kitchen garden, since the walk along the frozen river last week when he had tucked her hand inside his coat, and the gesture had been so natural and so right that she had known, with the certainty of a person who has finally arrived somewhere after a very long road, where she was. "I want to marry you too," she said. "I have wanted it for a while. I was waiting to see if you were certain." "I've been certain since October," he said. "Then we wasted some time," she said. He almost laughed, a full, genuine almost laugh, the kind she loved best because she so rarely saw it. "We did," he agreed. She stood up from her chair and he stood from his, and she walked around the table to him and put her hands against his chest and looked up at him and said, "Yes, John Hartwell, I will absolutely marry you." He kissed her, and it was different from the first kiss in the kitchen lamplight, fuller, warmer, a kiss that carried its intention plainly and did not need to be careful because there was nothing left to be careful about. They married on a Saturday in March of 1880 in Caldwell, in the small Methodist church on Lincoln Street. The ceremony was performed by the minister, a man named Reverend Lyle, who had a gray beard and a genuine warmth about him that made the whole thing feel less like a legal transaction and more like what it actually was. Ray Colbeck came up from Emporia for it, looking considerably more relaxed than when he had left the ranch, his wife's health having improved over the winter. Victor Price was there, and Caleb Marsh and a handful of the other hands who had become, in the way of people who shared daily life over a long time, something like family. Hester wore the best dress she had, which she had taken in and pressed and trimmed with ribbon she bought at the Mercantile in Caldwell, and she thought she probably looked like a woman who had made her own wedding dress out of practical necessity and limited resources, which was entirely true and which she did not mind at all. John wore his good suit and his best boots, and looked at her when she came down the aisle of that small church with an expression on his face that she would carry for the rest of her life, open and certain, and warm in a way his face rarely was in public, as though in this moment he did not care who saw what he felt. Reverend Lyle pronounced them man and wife, and John kissed her in front of God and Caldwell and Ray Colbeck and the assembled ranch hands, and Caleb Marsh made a sound that was technically a cleared throat, but was actually a deeply moved young man doing his best. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon light, and the prairie in March was just beginning to show the first green under the winter pale grass, and the river was running again, freed from its freeze, and the cottonwoods along the bank were putting out the earliest possible buds, and it was not a dramatic landscape. It was not Switzerland or the coast of Maine. It was Kansas, flat and wide and enormous, with a sky that went on without apology, and Hester Ellsworth Hartwell looked at it from the wagon seat with her husband's hand warm over hers, and felt something she had waited 26 years to feel, which was that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The spring of 1880 brought new calves and new hands and new growth in the kitchen garden, and Hester threw herself into the life of the ranch as a full partner in it now, not just in the housekeeping, which she continued to manage, but in the larger operation. She had a facility for organization and numbers that John had recognized from the beginning, and he actively sought her counsel on the business side of the ranch in ways that raised eyebrows occasionally in Caldwell. A rancher consulting his wife on cattle accounts and supply contracts was not entirely conventional, but John's response to raised eyebrows had always been a philosophical indifference, and this did not change after marriage. In June of 1880, Hester told John she was expecting a child. He was at his desk in the office, working through the summer drive accounts, when she came to the doorway and said it directly, the way they had always said direct things to each other, and he put down his pen and turned in his chair and looked at her for a long moment in which she watched a great number of things move across his face: surprise, wonder, a flash of the old fear she knew he carried, and then something that settled over all of it like a clear sky after rain. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said. He stood up and came to her and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her with those creekwater eyes that she knew now better than she knew her own, and she watched the last trace of fear dissolve. "I am going to be a very attentive nuisance about this," he warned her. "I already know that," she said. "I am preparing myself." He was, in fact, an attentive nuisance of the most endearing kind, concerned about her eating, concerned about her rest, deeply suspicious of any task that involved climbing anything or lifting anything he considered too heavy, and engaged in a running, half-humorous negotiation with her about the definition of too heavy that lasted the entire pregnancy. She gave ground where she thought it was reasonable and held her ground where she did not, and he accepted her judgment on the distinction because that was how they worked, and the result was that she was neither coddled into uselessness nor allowed to overextend herself in the way she might have done left entirely to her own stubborn devices. Victor Price managed the summer drives with impressive efficiency, and the yield was better than the previous 2 years, and the ranch's accounts at the end of the season showed a health that reflected the combination of John's management and Hester's reorganization of the supply and account systems. John was pleased. Hester was pleased. Ray Colbeck came up from Emporia for a visit in August and was pleased also, and said so, and sat on the porch with John for an entire afternoon, catching up on 2 years of accumulated ranch news, while Hester sat nearby with her mending, and contributed to the conversation at regular intervals. And Ray Colbeck went back to Emporia with the settled feeling of a man who has seen something come right that he always hoped would. Caleb Marsh, who was now 20 and had developed from a nervous boy into a confident young man, had been given increasing responsibility over the past year and was beginning to show the makings of a genuine foreman. Victor Price was grooming him deliberately, and John watched this development with satisfaction. The ranch had, over the course of 2 years, become something quite specific, a place where work was respected, where people were treated with fairness, where the rod of casual cruelty had been cut out before it could spread, and where the result was a group of people who were, collectively, better at their work and better to each other than they would otherwise have been. This was not an accident. It was the result of a series of choices, some dramatic and some daily and small, beginning with a morning in a yard in June of 1879, when John Hartwell had heard something he could not forgive and acted on it without hesitation. On the 3rd of February, 1881, Hester gave birth to a son. The birth was attended by the doctor from Caldwell, a woman named Mrs. Tate who served as midwife for half the county, and who had the calm authority of someone who had seen every possible complication and was prepared for all of them. It was a long labor, 14 hours, and it was at various points frightening in the way that childbirth in 1881 was frequently frightening, when the outcome was not certain until it was. John stayed as close as he was permitted, which was not very close, and spent a significant portion of the night in a state of the kind of suppressed terror that does not show on a man's face but shows in what he does with his hands. When Mrs. Tate came out of the room and told him he had a son, and that both mother and child were well, he sat down in the nearest chair with an abruptness that was entirely uncharacteristic of a man who prided himself on composure, and it took him a full 2 minutes to trust his legs enough to stand again. He was allowed in, and Hester was propped against the pillows looking exhausted and luminous in the particular way of women who have just done something enormous and are not yet entirely sure it has happened, and she was holding a small red-faced bundle that was making intermittent sounds of protest at the world. "Hello," John said, and it was not clear whether he was addressing his wife or his son, which was probably appropriate. "He has your chin," Hester said. "My chin is not a particular gift to give someone," John said. "I disagree," she said. "I like your chin very much." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms, and he held his son for the first time with the careful precision of a man who has never done this before and is deeply aware of the weight and fragility of what he is holding, and Hester watched his face do something she had never seen it do. It simply opened, entirely, like a room with all its windows thrown wide, and she thought she had never loved him more than she did in that moment. They named him Edward James Hartwell, for his grandfather, and for no other particular reason except that it seemed right to carry something forward from the man who had built this place, the man who had run it honestly for 30 years, the man who had known right from wrong without always having the words for it. Edward James, who was immediately Eddie to everyone on the ranch, arrived, and the ranch changed again in ways that were impossible to predict and entirely wonderful. The Hands, who had collectively become something like a family over the preceding 2 years, were besotted with him in the way of hardened working men who find themselves confronted with an infant and discover they have no defenses against it. Caleb Marsh, in particular, had no idea what to do with himself whenever he was in proximity to Eddie, and the expression on his face during these encounters was one of the funniest things Hester had ever seen on a human being. Victor Price maintained his dignity somewhat better, but was observed on 2 separate occasions making faces at the baby in the kitchen doorway when he thought no one was watching. Eddie grew. The ranch prospered. The marriage deepened into the kind of love that is not dramatic because it has become the ground everything else is built on, present in every daily exchange, in the texture of ordinary life, in the shared reference, and the accumulated understanding of people who have chosen each other fully. In the summer of 1882, when Eddie was 18 months old and terrorizing the kitchen with a toddle that was enthusiastic if unstable, Caleb Marsh became the Hartwell Ranch's new foreman, because Victor Price had accepted a position managing a larger operation in the Indian Territory, and recommended Caleb for the role with a wholehearted conviction that settled the matter. John consulted Hester on the appointment, as he consulted her on most significant ranch decisions, and she said what she had been observing for 2 years, that Caleb Marsh had become exactly the kind of man who understood that decency and effectiveness were not in competition with each other. He got the job, and he was very good at it. The letter from the Indianapolis law firm arrived with its resolution in late 1882. The estate had been finalized, Hester's share had been verified, and the sum was $83.40, which was the higher end of the original estimate. She deposited it in the ranch account, and John told her it was her money to do with as she chose, and she said it already was doing what she chose, which was contributing to something she considered her own, and he looked at her with the Creekwater eyes warm and clear and said nothing because there was nothing to say. In 1883, in the spring, Hester told John she was expecting again. "Are you well?" he asked, as he had asked the first time. "Exceptionally well," she said. He was somewhat less of an attentive nuisance the second time, having been reassured by the first time that she was extremely competent at this, and that Mrs. Tate from Caldwell was extraordinarily capable, and also having been gently but firmly informed by Hester that he had hovered at a level that she had found deeply endearing, but that she would prefer to reduce by approximately 20% for the second pregnancy. He tried. He got it down to perhaps 15%, which they both agreed was a reasonable outcome. In November of 1883, a daughter arrived. She was small and very loud, and had John's chin and Hester's eyes and hair the color of the autumn prairie grass, and they named her Clara Ruth Hartwell, for Hester's sister, and the ranch on the Chicaskia River greeted her arrival with the kind of celebration that had by now become entirely natural in a place where the people who worked and lived there had become genuine community. Caleb Marsh, who was now 23 and fully settled into his authority as foreman, stood in the yard the afternoon after Clara's birth and received the news from John with a grin so enormous it threatened the structural integrity of his face. "2 of them," he said. "2," John confirmed. "You are a brave man," Caleb said, with the particular confidence of a young man who did not yet have children. John looked at him with considerable equanimity. "Wait until you have your own," he said. Caleb's expression shifted into something that was approximately one-third confidence and two-thirds awareness that he had perhaps made a premature judgment. The years between 1880 and 1885 were the making of the Hartwell Ranch into something that outlasted the immediate people and circumstances that built it. The cattle operation expanded methodically, not recklessly, not with the overreach that had destroyed operations all over Kansas in various boom and bust cycles, but with the careful, sustainable expansion of a man who understood that land and animals required respect and long horizons. John hired an additional 6 hands over those years, and every one of them was chosen with the same set of qualities in mind: competence, yes, but also character, which John had come to understand were not as frequently separable as people sometimes wanted to believe. The new hands arrived to a ranch culture that was already established, which meant they arrived to a situation in which the norms were clear. This was a place of fair dealing and mutual respect, and the example at the top of it was unambiguous. 2 of them tested the edges of it, in small ways, in the first months, not dramatically, not in the way that had required Cole Briggs's firing, but in the habitual casual ways that people test the edges of new environments to see where the give is. They found no give. They adjusted. One of them became one of the best workers on the ranch within a year. Hester managed the household and much of the accounting and the domestic organization of the ranch with an authority that was natural and uncontested, because John had made clear from the beginning that his wife's domain and judgment were to be respected without qualification, and because the demonstration of that stance over years had established it so thoroughly that it no longer needed to be stated. She also did something else that she had not entirely planned, but that came naturally from who she was. She taught. Eddie had arrived at the age for learning letters and numbers, and she discovered in teaching him that she had her father's gift, not just for knowledge itself, but for the transmission of it, for finding the angle that made a thing comprehensible to a particular mind. She taught Eddie, and then Clara, and then, because word spread in the way that things spread in small communities, she found herself teaching 2 of the ranch hand family's children in the mornings, and then 3, and then 4. By 1885, Hester Hartwell was running a small informal school in the ranch house 2 mornings a week, teaching 8 children ranging in age from 5 to 12, and the quality of what she offered was good enough that a family from a neighboring ranch 6 miles west had asked if their children could attend, and she had said yes, because the idea of saying no to children who wanted to learn was entirely foreign to her nature. John built her a schoolroom. He did it without prompting, over the course of a winter, adding a room to the east side of the house with proper windows and a proper chimney and space enough for 12 students at proper desks, which he had made by the carpenter in Caldwell. When it was finished, he showed it to her on a January morning with the characteristic absence of theater. He simply opened the door and let her see it. She stood in the doorway of the schoolroom for a long time without speaking. The morning light came through the east windows at an angle that laid itself across the new wood floors in a way that was almost ceremonial, and she could smell fresh lumber and the new plaster on the walls, and the desks were arranged in 2 rows of 6, and there was a proper chalkboard at the front of the room on which someone, John, she realized, who never did anything by halves, had written, in his characteristic careful hand, a single equation. She turned around and looked at him. "My father would have loved this," she said. He nodded. "I know. How do you know? You never met him." "Because you're his daughter," John said simply, "and I know you." She crossed the space between them and kissed him in the doorway of the schoolroom he had built her, and the winter light lay across the Chicaskia River outside, and the prairie stretched away in every direction. And she was exactly where she was supposed to be, in exactly the life she was supposed to have. In the spring of 1885, Caleb Marsh married a woman named Alice Tanner, who was the daughter of a farmer east of Caldwell, and who had a directness about her that matched Caleb's own developing character perfectly. The wedding was a community event, held on the Hartwell Ranch, because John had offered the space and Hester had organized the celebration with the same efficient joy she brought to everything she organized. And it was one of those spring days that Kansas provides occasionally as recompense for its difficult winters, warm and clear, with a breeze that carried the smell of new grass and the river, and the cottonwoods just coming into full leaf. Hester stood beside John at the edge of the gathering, watching Caleb Marsh say his vows to Alice Tanner with a sincerity and solemnity that she found deeply moving. And she thought about the morning in the yard 6 years ago when a young man with the good sense to nod had caught her eye, and what it meant that he was standing here now, this confident, decent, capable man. And some part of her understood that the thing John had done that morning, the firing of Cole Briggs, the line he had drawn and held, had done more than protect her in a single moment. It had created an environment in which a young man who might have grown into something harder and smaller had instead grown into something open and good. That, she thought, was perhaps the truest measure of it. She told John this later, walking by the river in the long evening light after the wedding guests had gone. "You changed the shape of this place," she said, "when you fired Briggs, not just for me." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking carefully rather than not listening. "I did what was right," he said. "Most people know what's right," she said. "Fewer people do it. Fewer people do it immediately," he said. "When it costs something." She considered this. "What did it cost you?" "Briggs was a good roper," he said. She made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. He smiled, the real smile, the full one which she had worked out how to produce reliably over 6 years of marriage, and which she considered one of her most significant personal achievements. "And 1 or 2 of the others who left were decent workers," he added. "But the thing you replace them with is worth more than what you lose. A place where people can do their work without," he stopped, "without carrying something extra, something they shouldn't have to carry." "You knew that then," she said, "even before you had the words for it." "I knew it from my father," he said. "Who knew it from his. The Hartwells have always believed that decency is not a luxury." He paused. "My father just didn't always enforce it loudly enough." "You did," she said, "for you." "At first," she said, "but it became more than that. It became the standard." He looked at her in the evening light with the river moving beside them and the prairie gold in the late sun, and she thought she had perhaps said something true enough to name. "The standard," he said. "A ranch where people are treated well," she said, "does better work, runs better, stays together longer." She paused. "That's not soft, that's practical." "Is that why you think I did it?" he asked. "Practicality." She took his hand as they walked. "No," she said. "I think you did it because it was right. The practicality was the consequence, not the motive." He held her hand and they walked along the river in the late light, and the cattle moved somewhere in the distance, and Eddie's voice high and carrying, the way children's voices came from somewhere near the barn, and Clara's answer came a beat behind it, and the ranch was full of all the things it had become, and quiet in all the ways that mattered. The years continued to build themselves onto each other in the way that good years do, each one adding to the substance of what had been established. By 1887, the Hartwell Ranch had become something that people in the area referenced not just for the quality of its cattle operation, which was real and well regarded, but for the quality of its character, which was harder to quantify but equally real. People who wanted to work for John Hartwell came for the wages and stayed for the environment. People who worked there once and moved on spoke well of it afterward. Caleb Marsh's management style, shaped by what he had absorbed under John's direction, reflected the same values, and the ranch crew that operated under him in the later years of the decade was among the most stable and cohesive in the county. Eddie Hartwell, at 6, was already showing the same quality of attention that his father brought to everything, a focused, quiet observational intelligence that could sit with a problem until it resolved. Clara, at 4, was more like her mother in temperament, direct, curious, impatient with obstacles, delighted by numbers and by the names of things. Together they were a running source of noise and investigation and periodic mild disaster, and the ranch hands had collectively adopted them as a kind of ongoing project, each of the hands finding their own way to be useful to or entertained by the Hartwell children. Hester's school had grown into something more formal by 1887. The neighboring families who had initially sent their children informally had begun to speak of establishing a proper subscription school, and there were discussions in Caldwell about a school district for the rural area that included the Hartwell Ranch and the farms and smaller ranches in its vicinity. Hester was involved in these discussions, asked for her opinion by people who had seen what she had built in the ranch schoolroom, and she gave it clearly and with the same directness she brought to everything. John, at 40, had the look of a man who had been built by the particular combination of hard work and deep satisfaction, weathered but not depleted, solid in the way of something that has been properly made and regularly used. His hair had more gray in it than the dark of their early years together, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of watching the open sky, and his hands had the story of the land written in them in ways that required no translation. He was, in every essential way, the man she had begun to fall in love with in the evenings of a Kansas summer, and had been discovering continuously ever since, and she had never found the end of him, which she considered the greatest gift the years had given her. In the winter of 1888, Hester discovered she was expecting a third child. She told him on a Sunday evening in January, sitting by the fire in the parlor that had evolved over the years from an almost formal room into the genuine heart of the household, full of books, and Eddie's drawings, and Clara's collection of interesting rocks, and the lamp that John had chosen because it gave the best light for reading, and the blanket Hester had made 2 winters ago that everyone in the household fought gently over when the evenings were cold. "Again," John said. "Again," she confirmed. He looked at the fire for a moment. She watched him. There was no fear now in the way there had been the first time, or the cautious waiting of the second. What she saw instead was a simple, genuine warmth. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said, as she always said. He reached over and took her hand, as he always did, and they sat by the fire in the house he had been born in and she had come to as a stranger and made into her home, and the wind moved over the prairie outside and the house held them. The third child was born in August of 1888, another son, who arrived loudly and with evident enthusiasm for existence, which suggested he would fit into the household's particular character without difficulty. They named him Frederick Ray Hartwell, for no historical Hartwell reason, but because Hester had always liked the name Frederick, and Ray Colbeck, who was by now retired in Emporia but in excellent spirits, was informed of the honor by letter and wrote back a reply that John read aloud at the supper table, and that made Hester laugh until she had to put down her fork. Eddie, at 7, received the new baby with the cautious respect of a child, who has learned that small creatures are unpredictable and deserve careful observation before assumptions are made. Clara, at 5, received Frederick with proprietorial enthusiasm and immediately attempted to assist with every aspect of his care in ways that required gentle but firm management. Frederick himself seemed unbothered by either response, being primarily focused on the business of existing and eating, and making his opinions known. By 1890, the Hartwell Ranch had been in operation for 31 years under 2 generations of Hartwells, and the year that John turned 41 and Hester 37, the books showed the healthiest returns the operation had ever recorded. The subscription school district had been formally established, with Hester named as the area's first certificated teacher. She had studied for and passed the territorial examination in 1889, which required considerable effort on top of everything else she was managing, and John had supported this with total conviction and considerable practical help. Taking on additional household tasks during the examination preparation period without complaint, and without making her feel it was a burden. The certificate had arrived on a Tuesday, and she had held it in her hands for a long moment at the kitchen table, reading her name in the formal official script, Hester Ellsworth Hartwell, certificated teacher, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing that her father had believed she was capable of being, confirmed and official and real. She had put it on the wall of the schoolroom. John had looked at it on the wall and said, "Your father was right," and she had agreed with him. In the autumn of 1890, Ray Colbeck's wife passed away peacefully in Emporia, and Ray wrote to John to say that he was at loose ends without her and wondering if there was any use for an old foreman on the Chicaskia. John wrote back the same day he received the letter, which was not John's usual pace for correspondence. And a month later, Ray Colbeck arrived at the ranch with his gear and his gray-streaked beard, and an expression of a man who has found his way back to the right place at the right time. He did not serve as foreman, that was Caleb's work, and rightly so, but he existed as something harder to name and more essential, a repository of knowledge, a steady presence, an extra pair of skilled hands in the seasons that needed them, and a witness to the whole arc of what the ranch had been and had become. He sat on the porch with John in the evenings when the work was done, and he drank his coffee and offered observations and asked questions, and it was the exact right thing. Caleb Marsh and Alice Hartwell had 2 children of their own by 1890, a son named Jim and a daughter named Me, and the ranch had become, in the full sense of the word, a community. It was the kind of community that the West sometimes produced and more often did not, one that had been deliberately and consistently built on the belief that the people in it deserved respect, and that had become, as a result, more than the sum of its working parts. Hester taught school 4 mornings a week. She managed the household accounts and continued her involvement in the ranch's business side. She was known in Caldwell as a person whose opinion was worth having, and she gave it when asked without apology, and without the particular hedging that women of her time were often expected to perform. She had John's full and genuine support in this, which meant a great deal in practical terms. A woman whose husband backed her without qualification was, in 1890 Kansas, significantly less constrained than one who operated without that backing, and she was clear-eyed enough about the injustice of that to name it, even as she benefited from it. She talked about it with John on a winter evening, 1891, when the children were in bed and Ray had retired to his room, and the house was quiet in the particular way it got when the temperature outside dropped enough to make the frost on the windows geometric and beautiful. "I think about the women who don't have what I have," she said. He understood immediately what she meant because he always understood what she meant. "The backing," he said. "Yes, what I can do, the school, the accounts, the way I can speak in Caldwell, it's possible because you stand behind it. Other women don't have that. What they deserve shouldn't depend on who they're married to," he said. "No," she agreed. "It shouldn't." She was quiet for a moment. "But it does, so I try to use what I have to make it easier for the ones who come after." The school matters for that too. Girls who know they can learn, who see that it's possible, they grow up differently, he said. They grow up knowing more about what they're capable of, she said. He reached over and refilled her coffee cup from the pot on the stove, and she accepted it and sat with it warming her hands, and they stayed in the comfortable silence that was their most familiar place. Not an absence of communication, but the fullest form of it, the kind that only exists between people who have been paying close attention to each other for a very long time. The years of the early 1890s brought changes to the West that were felt even on the Chicaskia. The cattle business was shifting. The long drives were giving way to the railroad, which had made the trail drives that had defined the previous decade increasingly unnecessary. The Hartwell operation adapted, as John had always adapted, methodically and without panic, adjusting the herd composition, working more closely with the rail shipping points that had established themselves in Caldwell and Wichita, focusing on the quality of the cattle rather than simply the quantity. The ranch survived the transition that ate several of its neighbors, not because John was lucky, but because he was careful, and because Hester's financial management had given them enough margin to weather the adjustment. In 1893, Eddie Hartwell was 12 years old and deeply interested in everything: the cattle operation, the accounts, the school, the history of the land, the question of what the Indian Territory to the south was going to become. He read everything he could find, which on a working ranch was limited, and Hester made it a priority to keep him supplied, ordering books through the merchant in Caldwell, borrowing from the small library that had opened in town, writing to her sister Margaret in Cleveland to send whatever she had finished reading. Clara at 10 was the student her mother had been at the same age: quick, voracious, already beginning to show the particular gift for numbers that had run so clearly from grandfather to daughter to granddaughter. She had decided she would be a teacher. This plan was met with complete seriousness by her parents, which was the correct response. Frederick at 5 was the most purely physical of the three children, always in motion, always involved in something that was either adventurous or inadvisable or both, already best friends with young Jim Marsh, and engaged with him in enterprises that kept their respective parents in a state of amused vigilance. He loved the horses with a depth that was almost frightening in its early seriousness, and the horses, the Hartwell string was excellent, seemed to reciprocate. John watched his children and felt the fullness of a life that had been built by choice and maintained by commitment, and he was grateful for all of it in the quiet, inarticulate way that he was grateful for everything that mattered to him, not with speeches or declarations, but with the sustained fact of his presence, his attention, his work. He was grateful above all for Hester. He told her this on a September evening in 1893, which was 14 years after she had arrived in Caldwell on a stage with a carpetbag and $4.30, and the reasonable expectation that life was probably going to be difficult. They were on the porch after supper, in the warm last light of the autumn day, and the children were inside with Ray playing some card game that involved a great deal of argument and no small amount of laughter, and the ranch spread out before them in the familiar geography of their shared life. The outbuildings, the barns, the bunkhouse, the kitchen garden, the cottonwoods along the river gold again in the September air. "I want to tell you something," John said. She looked at him, comfortable against his shoulder. "All right. I think about the morning in the yard," he said. She understood immediately. She always understood immediately. "The morning with Briggs." Yes, he was quiet for a moment. "I think about what was there before I went around the corner of that bunkhouse, and what was there after." "Tell me," she said. "Before the ranch was running, the work was done. The accounts were adequate. Everything was functioning." He paused. "And I went around that corner and heard what he said to you, and something clarified. The way things clarify when you finally name the thing that was wrong." He stopped again, gathering it. "I knew that what he said was wrong. I knew that a place where a woman could be spoken to that way was wrong. I knew that a place where other men stood by and said nothing was wrong. And I knew," he looked at her then, the Creekwater eyes clear in the evening light, "I knew that you were worth every hand I'd have to fire to make it right." She was quiet. "I did not know then," he said, "that you were going to be my wife. I did not know that I was about to fall in love with you. I knew only that the thing Briggs said was intolerable, and that firing him was the only honest response." He shifted slightly so he could see her face fully. "But I have thought about it many times since, and I think—" "What?" she asked. "I think some choices are the shape of your whole life before you know it," he said. "I think that morning was the shape of this." She looked out at the prairie for a long moment, at the cottonwoods going gold and the river catching the last light and the sky above the flat horizon doing what the Kansas sky always did, which was simply being enormous and undefensive about it. "I came here expecting it to be difficult," she said. "I had learned to expect difficult. I know. And it was in the beginning. The men were, some of them were," she paused. "But then you came around the corner of that bunkhouse." She smiled, slow and full. "And you fired Cole Briggs before breakfast." He almost laughed. "He was a good roper." "He was a poor excuse for a man," she said, and she said it without venom, simply as fact, the way she said all facts. He was quiet for a moment. "The ranch is better without him." "Yes," she said, "it is." she settled more fully against his shoulder, quieter and better. They sat together on the porch of the house he had been born in and that she had made into a home, in the September evening light of a Kansas autumn, with the sound of their children arguing cheerfully over a card game inside and the old foreman's laugh rising above the argument, and the prairie stretching in every direction as far as a person could see, which on a clear evening was very far indeed. In the years that followed, the ranch continued to grow, and the children continued to grow, and the marriage continued to grow, which is what marriages do when they are tended with the same care and honest dealing that John Hartwell had always believed was owed to every good and living thing. Eddie grew into a young man who was his father's partner in the cattle operation and his mother's equal in the account books, and whose blend of both of them produced something new and particular and excellent. Clara went to the normal school in Wichita at 17, studied for 2 years, and came back with her own certificate and a plan, which involved expanding the Chicaskia School District, and which she executed with the methodical tenacity of someone who had been watching 2 very good examples of how to do difficult things well. Frederick grew into the horseman the 5-year-old had promised he would be, and the Hartwell horses under his eventual management became known across the region as the finest in the county, which was a form of excellence he had been working toward since he was old enough to hold a lead rope. Ray Colbeck died in the winter of 1897, peacefully in his room at the ranch house, and the funeral was attended by more people than anyone who had not known Ray Colbeck could have predicted, because the measure of a life is not in the positions it held but in the people it touched, and Ray Colbeck had touched many. Caleb Marsh spoke at the service with a precision and warmth that honored his old mentor exactly right, and John stood beside Hester in the cold Kansas air of that February afternoon and held her hand and grieved without apology for a man who had been quietly essential to everything. The ranch went on. The family went on. The school went on and grew, and eventually became an official county school with Clara Hartwell as its first certificated teacher, and then its superintendent, which was an unprecedented thing for a woman in that county in 1902, and which was preceded and enabled by 20 years of the kind of work and reputation that could not be denied. Hester Hartwell, who had been Hester Ellsworth, who had arrived in Caldwell in April of 1879 with a carpetbag and $4.30, and the composed resignation of someone who had learned to expect difficulty, sat on the porch of the ranch house in the autumn of 1903 and watched her grandson, Caleb and Alice's oldest boy's son, which made the arithmetic complicated but the affection uncomplicated, try to teach Eddie's oldest son to rope, and listened to her husband's voice from inside the house, reading aloud to Frederick's youngest in the late afternoon quiet. She was 50 years old, and she was entirely well, and the prairie stretched out in every direction in the last gold of the September light, and the cottonwoods along the river were turning again, as they did every year, as they always would. She thought of her father, who had believed that knowledge was worth having for its own sake. She thought of the stage into Caldwell, the dust, and the long road. She thought of a morning in a yard in June when a man had come around the corner of a bunkhouse and heard something he could not forgive, and had acted on it without hesitation because he was the kind of man who did. She thought of the quiet that followed, the better quiet. The quiet of a place from which something wrong had been removed and something right had been allowed to grow. John came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her in the chair that was always his chair, because after 23 years there were chairs that were simply certain people's chairs, and handed her the cup, and she took it and held the warmth of it in her hands. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About the morning with Briggs," she said. He was quiet a moment. "I think about it sometimes, too." "What do you think?" she asked. He looked at the prairie and the river and the cottonwoods and the children somewhere in the yard beyond them, and the whole accumulated fact of the life they had built together in this place. "I think I would do it again," he said, "without question, without hesitation. She leaned against his shoulder, as she had been leaning against his shoulder for 23 years, and felt the warmth of him and the steadiness of him, and the particular quality of being known entirely by another person, and choosing to be known and being glad of it every single day. "I know," she said. The cottonwoods moved in the light autumn wind, and the river ran on in the way it had run on for longer than anyone alive could remember, and the ranch on the Chicaskia River was quiet in the evening, and it was better, and it was whole.